These are the supplies I'll be using for today's painting. You can find a list of them in the video description. These are the paint colors I will be using in today's painting. These are also listed in the video description. You don't need these exact colors, just use what you have and get somewhere close. Also in the video description is a line drawing as well as a reference photo that you can download. Print the line drawing at the dimensions you would like to do your painting. On the back of your line drawing, take pencil and apply graphite all over the back of the image. Position it directly on top of your watercolor paper so the graphite is touching. Tape it in position so it does not shift, and then take a standard ballpoint pen and trace the entire line drawing. Just with the pressure of your pen, it's going to actually push the graphite directly onto your watercolor paper, transferring your entire subject. I've done this already, so I'm going to remove my line drawing. With watercolors being transparent, we do need to be aware of our pencil lines. So I like to use a kneaded eraser, and anywhere where I have really soft values, like lots of whites or very, very soft light blues, I'm going to choose to lighten my pencil lines so they are less likely to show up in the finished painting. This is just a kneaded eraser, and I'm just tapping it along the pencil lines in the areas where I have a lot of those whites and light blues. I'm double checking, making sure I have all the lines lightened up where I want them. I'll lighten up a little bit on the nose or beak. Maybe a little bit on the feet. And a little bit on the edges of my basket. But otherwise, the rest of the lines are right up against an edge where there is a dark color, so we should be able to easily hide the rest of the pencil lines with minimal effort. So I feel like this is okay for now. Now I am going to choose to paint the background first, but in order to not worry about getting into some of these, tight spaces with my water and paints, I'm just going to mask my subject so that I can protect it. To do that, I'm going to use this particular masking fluid. I'm going to put a small amount of water into a water cup, and then I'm going to add Dawn dish soap to that water. I'm going to then take the brush I plan on applying the masking fluid with, and I'm just going to coat it really well with this soapy water. This is going to add a layer of protection to my paintbrush so the masking fluid doesn't ruin it. I'm going to apply this masking fluid slowly around the outer edges of my subject. The way you apply your masking fluid is very important. It's just as important as the paint, so really take your time with it. So I'm just going along the outside edge of my subject that is right near background elements. I'm going to rinse the masking fluid out of my brush using my soapy water. And I'm going to re-dip in my masking fluid. Rinsing frequently in your soapy water is what's going to protect your brush. Otherwise, masking fluid can dry very quickly and actually ruin your brushes. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. We have a white splash here. So I'm just masking those areas that I want to remain white so I can paint the background freely and not worry about it. I'm going to choose not to mask the fishing rod because it is such a dark brown and the background is going to be such a soft blue. Those colors are going to layer on top of each other really easily. But I am going to take a moment to just double check where I have applied my masking fluid and just make sure I'm happy with the quality. Make sure I didn't miss anything. If I feel like there's an area that's questionable, I simply add a second layer just so I have peace of mind. I'm now going to just rinse my brush out so there's no masking fluid sitting in it. And I can go ahead and begin mixing the paint colors for my background. I'm going to use a large round brush. I'm going to rinse it, make sure no paint colors are in there from a previous painting. And I'm just going to use my brush to carry some water over to different wells on my paint palette. One of the colors I plan on mixing up is just a really soft cerulean blue. So this is more of a baby blue color. The appearance of the color in my palette can be very deceiving. So I'm grabbing a scrap piece of paper, and after I fully load my brush and wipe it across the rim of my palette, I'm going to test out the value of my paint color. If I'm happy with that value, then I'm going to rinse my brush and mix the next color. I'm now going to grab some ultramarine blue. Testing out my value. I think I want this color to be a little darker. Now going to rinse the paint out of my brush. I'm now going to mix a mixture of the ultramarine blue along with some Payne's gray. Payne's gray is a very strong pigment. It does not take much of the color, so small amounts are better. And I'm going to be adding that ultramarine blue to it so I can get kind of this beautiful gray-blue color. I'm also going to add just a little bit of this ultramarine blue to my cerulean blue so they look like they're more of the same color family, and it'll just give me better color harmony in my finished painting. Now in that time frame, my masking fluid is nearly dry. I have a couple areas that still look wet, so I'm going to hit those with the blow dryer. Once you've confirmed your masking fluid is completely dry, take a large round brush with clean water and apply clean water all over the background. Go right up next to the masking fluid. If you get on top of the masking fluid just a little bit, that's okay. Just try not to go past the masking fluid. I think I am going to lighten my pencil lines on my fishing rod just a little bit before I wet everything, because I know from experience that just even a little bit of water with paint will lock in all your pencil lines and you will not be able to get rid of them. Now the first areas I applied clean water are already beginning to dry. So I'm making a point to double check all areas of my background, tilting my head to the side so I can use that light source in my studio to see if there's any areas that are losing that glossy shine. Making sure there's no areas that I missed. Once you've wet the entire background with your clean water, you can now begin adding some paint colors. We're going to have to do this in a few different layers, but I am going to start with my light cerulean blue that I added that ultramarine blue to, and I just want to create some soft shadows and values to the whites of the snow. I don't want to go too heavy, and I can come back and kind of soften some of these colors before the next layer. But I want to pay attention to where shadows are and make sure I get this soft color in those areas. The color of the water towards the back is a much lighter blue, so I'm making a point to get a soft blue in that water. I'm also going to use this soft blue to give a hint of blue sky towards the top of my painting. Some of the color down below on the white snow seems a little harsh. It's very dark, so I can clean my brush and dry it using a sponge or paper towel, and I can come in here and use the absorbency of my dry brush to kind of pick up and soften some of these blues that are in the foreground here on the snow. And I can always come back and add some titanium white later if I want. Okay, I'm now going to switch to my number 2 round. I want a smaller brush this time because I don't want to introduce such a large quantity of paint. I'm going to my ultramarine blue, and I'm going to focus this ultramarine blue just to this little fishing hole here. I'm going to get some of that Payne's gray with the ultramarine blue. And I just want to bump up the contrast on the back side of this little fishing hole. I'm now going to return to my ultramarine blue. And I just want to darken up some of this lake water. I'm keeping my brush direction horizontal to kind of move with the landscape. Going right over top of the masking fluid, not worried about that at all. That's good enough for my first layer. I need to let this dry so I can paint some more details after. Now that things are completely dry, I'm going to take clean water with my large round brush, and I'm just going to apply some clean water within just the little pond. I'm not going into the area of the snow. And I'm using very gentle pressure with a soft brush so I don't lift or gouge those previous layers. And I'm being very gentle with the amount of pressure I apply with my brush. Once I have everything damp, I'm going to give a little bit more definition to this lake by grabbing some of that cerulean blue and going right up to the edge of this lake on the back half. I'm drying my brush off after rinsing it just so I can soak up any puddling of this cerulean blue. Once I've evened that out, I'm going to grab some ultramarine blue and give a little bit more definition to the front edge of this lake. If I have puddling of paint, I simply dry my brush off by tapping my sponge or paper towel. And I go back to my painting with a dry brush, and I simply tap the areas where I might have some puddling of paint. While that little lake is drying, I'm going to do the same thing to the watering hole. I'm going to add just a small amount of water to the watering hole. And I'm now going to grab that ultramarine blue to give that watering hole just a little bit more definition. I'm trying to give a little bit more of a textured edge. I don't want it to be a perfect oval or circle. I want it to look like it's up against some snowbanks. I want the front edge of this watering hole to be slightly lighter, and I want the back edge to be a little darker. So I'm going to grab some of that Payne's Gray with the ultramarine mixed in, just to get a little bit of color on the back half. And I can add more definition later once this dries. I'm now going to switch to my number 2 round brush. I want to use some of the cerulean and ultramarine blue, but I want it to be a lighter value. So I've pulled it aside on my paint palette, added some water, and I want to soften it up so it is a very, very faint color. So I've tested it out, and this is the value of it. Really nice and light. And I'm now just going to give a hint of a mountain in the background. Once I have the top edge of the mountain defined, I rinse my brush and I just get some clean water to soften the bottom edge of that mountain so it kind of fades into my background. While that's drying, I'm going to give a little bit more definition to some of the shadows around my objects. I'm going to use the same soft blue, but I'm now going to come near the penguin, painting wet on dry. Just adding a little bit more shadow color. Adding shadows around the little tackle box. Going to add a little bit of shadows behind the penguin. Now I'm going to add a couple trees in the background behind the head of my penguin. I'm going to switch to my number 6 round brush. And before I begin the trees, I'm just going to add a small amount of water to the snow on the ground where the trees will end. I'm not bringing the water all the way to the lake edge. I'm now going to use my number 2 round. I'm going to grab some of that Payne's Gray and Ultramarine mixture. And I'm going to start with a tall tree towards the left. I'm just kind of tapping my brush to create the silhouette. As this tree comes in contact with the water I applied, it just kind of softens, which is exactly what I wanted. I'm using a dry brush just to soak up any puddling within this tree silhouette before I move on to the next tree. The next tree I'm going to do in just the ultramarine blue, so it's a little lighter in value. I'm trying to be aware of my negative space so I can create an interesting shape to my tree. And I can get an even lighter blue to just give the hint of a tree that may be right next to the hat. I'm going to let those trees dry. The mountain on the right side of my penguin has already dried, so I'm going to use the really light blue that I used on the shadows to create some real faint, distant tree line in the background. I'm not going to put too many details into these trees. I'm just going to focus on having different heights. I'm going right over top of the fishing rod. I'm just going to grab that cerulean blue. I'm going to make a small tree silhouette that is a little taller than the mountain. I'm then going to grab some of that Payne's Gray and Ultramarine mixture and make a taller tree. I'm now going to check on the pond, and it feels still damp to the touch, so I'm going to hit that with a blow dryer before I add texture to the water. I'm going to use a square brush to lift some ripples with horizontal lines in the background. I'm going to get my brush wet, and I'm going to use my fingers like a squeegee, going across the bristles of the brush to remove any water droplets that might be hanging out on the metal. Once I have a wet brush, I'm now going to keep my brush horizontal with the horizon line, and I'm barely applying any pressure. I'm just going back and forth on the blue with my square brush. And because my brush is wet and a little on the more stiff side, it's lifting up some highlights for me, giving the illusion of distant ripples. As I get closer to the foreground, I'm going to allow more space between my ripples. I can soften up some of the edges on the back of the lake using my damp brush, just so the pigment isn't so strong and bold. Elements in our background should be a little softer in detail. So I'm continuing with a wet brush, and I'm going to repeat the same thing on the opposite side of my penguin, just lifting some horizontal lines to create the illusion of ripples. If your lines are coming out very, very wide, that means you're applying too much pressure. If you look closely, my brush is barely bending as I move it across my paper. That's how light-handed I'm being. Now I can use this same technique for some of the ripples in this watering hole. I'm going to focus more on the front edge. However, these little ripples need to be more at a curve. So I'm using more of the corner of my square brush. And any ripples that I lift, I'm trying to do so following that curve. Now that all of the lifting is done, I'm going to return to a small number 2 round. I'm going to take some of my ultramarine blue, and I'm going to darken up just some of the ripples that are near the foreground. I'm not worried about the background. So I'm just doing little subtle wavy lines that are different lengths, but still moving horizontally across the water. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side, but I'm being aware of how far up I took my dark blue ripples, and I'm going directly across to the opposite side, and I'm going to try and maintain that same height. I can now go to the watering hole with the Payne's Gray and Ultramarine mixture, and I can just give a little bit more definition to some of these ripples. So we want to think of really, really flat ovals for the correct angle. I'm now going to be switching to just my ultramarine mixture without the Payne's Gray. I'm now going to use a little bit of that cerulean blue. I want to water it down a bit so it's not very dark. And there's just a couple areas on the snowbanks that I want to just add some shadows to give a hint of maybe some angles and crests. I'm going to make sure that my shadows are as dark as I would like them to be, because once I remove the masking fluid, creating some of these shadows may be a little more challenging because you have to avoid the objects. All right, I'm going to dry this so I can remove the masking fluid. To remove the masking fluid, I really just need to use pressure from my hands. Another great tool to remove masking fluid besides your fingers is called a rubber cement pickup. The only downside to using a rubber cement pickup is if you drag it across any pencil lines, it will erase your pencil lines. So just try not to go too wide with your movements when you're using a rubber cement pickup so you can maintain the majority of your pencil lines from your transfer. I may have to redraw some of these pencil lines, but that's okay. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Something to be aware of when it comes to masking fluid is if you leave it on your paper for more than a week, the likelihood of you being able to remove the masking fluid is just significantly lower. If masking fluid stays on the paper too long because life gets busy, unfortunately, that masking fluid will want to permanently stay on your paper. So when you're using masking fluid, make sure you have the time that week to bring your painting to a completed product so you can make sure to remove the masking fluid within the 7-day period. I like to take my fingertips and just double check the edges. Make sure there's no masking fluid that I have forgotten. Once I'm confident it has all been removed, I'm now going to get a pencil to just reestablish some of my lines. Now that I've reestablished my pencil lines, I'm going to mix up some red and green for the hat and scarf. So I'm using a number 6 round brush, and I'm just putting a small amount of water into a couple different wells on my palette. I'm going to get some of that sap green color, and I want it to be very vibrant. So I'm going to use quite a bit of the pigment. I'm now going to rinse my brush. And with a clean brush, I'm going to grab some of that cadmium red. I would like this to be vibrant as well. Before I begin adding the paint colors to my hat, I want to establish my shadows using a blue first. So I'm going to grab my ultramarine blue. And this is the same blue I used on the water. And I just want to go to this left edge of the hat. And I don't want this to be too dark. So I'm going to show you what the value looks like. This is how dark it is, so not very dark. And with this light ultramarine blue, I'm going to go to this left edge of the hat, right over top of all the stripes. And I'm just creating a shadow on this left edge. Before the paint dries, I'm taking a clean, damp brush to the right side of that paint stroke to soften the edge so it kind of fades in with the rest of the hat. Now I'm going to do this shadow technique also on the scarf. So I'm staying on the left side of the scarf, getting some blue in to establish some shadows. And before this paint dries, I'm taking a clean, damp brush to the right side of that paint stroke, just to kind of create that fade and gradient. Now I can't paint the stripes yet because the hat and scarf are still damp from this shadow. But what I can do is I can use a really watered down version of that cerulean blue to create some shadows on just parts of the penguin's white belly and face. So I'm really watering it down, making sure my color is not too dark. I just want to create a glaze. And one area that I want this glaze is I want it to be on the underside of the scarf. You can kind of soften that bottom edge so it fades and makes a shadow. I'm going to do the same thing just underneath the little fin. So I'm sticking to the left side, going around the basket and fish, going around the foot. Once I have that shadow in on the left side of the belly there, I can rinse my brush and use a barely damp brush to kind of pull the right edge of that paint stroke out so it looks like a shadow that fades. And this will soften even more once it dries. I'm going to do the same thing in between the feet. I want a shadow on the bottom of the belly. So I'm keeping the glaze really watered down. If I accidentally hit the fishing pole, it's no big deal because the colors we'll be using on that fishing pole are very dark, so you really don't have to avoid it. And then before it dries, I'm just going to go along the top edge of that paint stroke so I can make that color kind of fade. I'm going to do the same technique to the whites on the head of my penguin. So right along the left edge, I'm going to put some soft blue. And then I want this soft blue to kind of carry on below near the scarf. And before this dries, I'm going to take a clean, barely damp brush. If I feel like I have too much water on my brush, I'm drying it off on my sponge to keep control, just to create a little blue. I'm going to do the same thing on the back side. I'm going to try to avoid the beak. I'm just staying on the bottom portion. And then I'm just going to soften that blue on the top edge. So those areas are still drying, but I do have a foot that isn't sharing an edge with anything. I can also work on this tackle box, but I am going to be switching to a smaller paintbrush. I'm going to mix up a darker green. So I'm going to take sap green with ultramarine blue so I can get more of a forest hunter green. On the very top lid of this tackle box, I'm going to want a little bit more of a lime green. So I'm going to get some lighter green on my brush and just on the top portion of this tackle box. While that's drying, I can paint the feet because the areas where the feet are completely dry. So I'm going to grab some of that cadmium orange using my small number 2 brush. I'm just painting wet on dry. I don't want to come in contact with that tackle box because that is still damp. While I have the orange, I might as well paint the beak. If there's any puddling of paint, I dry my brush and just tap the top surface to soak up any puddles. I'm going to double check that things are dry and then I can begin on the hat. So I'm going to grab the sap green I mixed up. I'm going to paint this back stripe. I'm holding my brush very vertical so I can get into these really tight, narrow corners. I'm going to paint the stripe near the front of the hat. While that's drying, I can begin working on the stripes of the scarf. Trying to avoid the drool on my penguin. He's very excited about the fish he's catching. I'm going to check on the hat. That has dried, so I can now continue to work on the stripes up top here. I'm going to add some green tassels to the right side of the scarf. I'm now going to rinse my brush. I'm going to get some red on my brush, and I'm going to work on the little pom-pom on the top of the hat. I'm just going to fill it in for this first step. I want some texture on that outer edge. So I'm being okay with not being perfect and smooth. I want it to look fluffy. I'm going to make sure that these stripes have completely dried. Once I've confirmed that they have, then I can go ahead and begin painting the red stripes. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to continue with the red stripes on the scarf. I don't want to paint the drool on accident, so I'm trying to go around it. I'm also going to paint the red tassels on the left side of the scarf. Grab some more red on my brush and add some texture to the pom-pom at the top of the hat, just by adding dots. And then as I move to the right, my dots are going to have more spacing and be more sparing. So it kind of creates a gradient. I'm going to water down some of this red so it turns into a real soft, mellow pink. And I'm going to add this pink to the inside of the mouth. I can get some of the same green that I used on the hat, and I can paint the reel on the fishing pole. I also want to get these side pieces that are keeping the reel attached to the pole. I'm going to get some Payne's Gray, a rather dark version of it. So very little water, keeping the paint very dark. And I am going to paint the eyes of my penguin. I'm going to try and keep a little white for the reflection in the eye. We can also use this black to just create a little nostril on the beak. I'm going to use some of the cadmium orange and add some of the burnt umber so I can create a brown for the basket. This is what my color looks like. I don't want to go too dark with this first layer. I just want to add a glaze to the basket. I'm going to add more burnt umber to my mixture for the inside of the basket where it's darker and in shadow. Doing my best not to hit the fish. I'm going to use a little bit of the ultramarine with the Payne's Gray, but I'm going to water it down a little bit so it's not quite as dark. And I'm going to use this to paint the fish now that the basket is completely dry. I want the fish to be a darker value than the shadows on the penguin's stomach. I want good contrast. If it's not dark enough, it's going to blend in with each other, so add more pigment if you need to. I'm going to paint more of the tackle box. I'm going to add that ultramarine blue to my sap green, so it's a darker green. And I'm just going to paint this front edge of the tackle box. I can also kind of give an outline to the handle of the tackle box. I can use this same darker green to give a little bit more dimension to the reel of the fishing pole. I'm going to darken up the pink in the mouth of the penguin so there's more contrast between it and the beak. I'm going to get some more sap green on my brush and paint the right side of the tackle box. I can also use this sap green to do a glaze on the handle. I'm going to use my lighter ultramarine blue. This is the value I'm using. And I'm going to use this ultramarine blue to get some details on the hat stitching. So the first thing I want to do is I want to come to the underside of the hat just to give a little glaze so it looks like a shadow. I'm going to do the same thing on the top edge. Just kind of tracing the bottom and top edge of some of these sections of the hat. And then with this same blue, I can create a line that goes in between the stripes up to the pom-pom. So it kind of gives the feel of a stitched knitted hat. I can use the ultramarine blue with the Payne's gray to give a little bit more contrast on the hat if I feel like I didn't achieve it with the first glaze. You can also use the ultramarine and blue just to give a little bit more texture on the left half of the pom-pom so it looks like it's in shadow. I want to create a shadow between some of the folds in the scarf. So I'm using that Payne's gray and ultramarine mixture just to kind of give a little bit more definition. I'm going to return to the fish. I want to add more pigment to my mixture. This time I'm still working with ultramarine, but I am working with some of that added Payne's gray. I want it to be dark enough for me to get some details on the fish. So that's the value I'm working with. I'm not overloading my brush. I get paint on my brush and then I tap my sponge just to make sure it's not too much. And I just want to give some gills. I can water this down a little bit. And I can just add some value to that top half of the fish. But I don't want to be perfect about it. I want there to be some texture. I need to let that completely dry before I can add the eye to the fish. I can use a really watered down blue to paint the drool that's coming from the mouth. I can add little highlights of white at the end using a different paint, or I can just keep it this blue. I'm going to get my dark green, which is the sap green with the ultramarine blue. And I'm just going to add some line detail to the tackle box so we can define some of our edges. I'm going to get some brown on my brush so I can paint the fishing rod. I want the pole to end directly above where that water splash is. I'm going to use this dark brown as well on the texture of the basket. So I want to go underneath the lip of the basket to create a shadow. With this dark brown, I'm going to try and get some of the basket weaving texture. I'm also going to try and get some angled lines for the handle of the basket so it looks like it's a twisted handle. I can do the same thing from the top lip of the basket. Give it some diagonal curved lines so it looks like it's twisted. I'm going to get some of that dark Payne's gray on my brush that has minimal water. And I'm going to paint the eye of the fish. I'm going to use my Payne's gray and ultramarine blue to create some of the eyelets on the fishing pole for the string. I'm now going to get some Payne's gray with minimal water. And I want to make it as black as possible without my paint feeling sticky or goopy. I still want to use the right amount of water. And I'm going to come into the head of the penguin and really just take my time. I'm now going to paint this fin that's holding the pole. I'm going to paint this small section of black down by the feet. I'm going to paint the black by the other foot. I'm going to paint the other fin, being aware of where my paint is wet on my paper so I don't accidentally rest my hand in that Payne's gray. That would be bad. Really slowing down when I get to some of these corners so my details don't get overlapped. I'm going to use some of that dark Payne's gray for the fishing line, but I really want to wipe off the excess paint on my sponge. I'm going to take my time and from the top of the fin that is holding the rod, I'm going to do a fishing line to the first eyelet, then to the second. I'm going to create fishing line from the fin down to the reel. And in order to get this vertical line accurate, I'm going to use a straight edge with a pencil, and I want to create a line that is parallel with the edge of my painting. And I'm just going to draw a pencil line here. Give myself something that is definitely straight and for me to trace with my paintbrush. If there's area of the lines that feels thick, you can just lighten that up. But now at least you have a straight line to trace. I'm going to give a little bit more detail to the eyelets because I feel like they're camouflaged into the background. I'm going to use this Payne's Gray to push some of the darks on parts of the reel. And I need to add just some subtle values to the water splash here. So I'm going to use a watered down blue. We don't have to paint the entire splash. But by at least adding some hint of color to parts of it, it will help. At this point, the level of detail is really up to you. But now you at least have all elements of the painting put together, and you can continue to kind of push the level of details and refine any of your edges on your own. But I hope the subject was playful and lifted your spirits for the holidays. Have a fantastic day.